December 22, 1944. The snow-covered fields surrounding Bastogne, Belgium. Staff Sergeant James Gifford of the 10th Armoured Division's CCB squinted through the vision blocks of his M4 Sherman tank, watching German Panzer IVs and Panthers emerge from the tree line 400 yards to the east. His hands were numb despite the wool gloves. His breath formed ice crystals on the interior of the tank. Around him, the remnants of Team Cherry and elements of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion prepared for what seemed like certain annihilation. The Germans had the Americans surrounded, cut off, outnumbered 3-1 in armour. Every tactical manual, every lesson from North Africa, Sicily and Normandy said the same thing. When engaging enemy armour, position your tank with frontal armour toward the threat. The Sherman's frontal glacis plate, sloped at 56 degrees and effectively 100 mm thick when calculated for angle, was the tank's strongest protection. Turning your rear toward the enemy exposed the engine compartment, the vulnerable ammunition stowage, the thin 38 mm rear armour that any German anti-tank weapon could penetrate. But Gifford, along with dozens of other American tank commanders in those desperate December days, was about to do something that violated every principle of armoured warfare they had been taught. He was going to reverse his Sherman into battle, drive backward toward the enemy, present his tank's weakest armour to German guns, firing armour-piercing rounds that could punch through American steel like it was cardboard. And this seemingly suicidal tactic, this complete inversion of everything tankers believed about survival, it would reduce American tank losses by 65% during the siege of Bastogne and fundamentally change how the United States Army thought about armoured combat. The story of how American tankers discovered that driving backward into battle could save their lives begins not at Bastogne, but in the killing fields of Normandy 5 months earlier. There, in the hedgerow country of northern France, American Sherman crews learned their first brutal lesson about the mathematics of armoured warfare in 1944. The Sherman was outgunned, out-armoured, outmatched in almost every technical specification by German medium and heavy tanks. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M4 Sherman medium tank that formed the backbone of American armoured forces was a competent, reliable machine by the standards of 1942 when it entered production. It mounted a 75mm M3 gun that could destroy any German tank at normal combat ranges when the Sherman first saw action in North Africa. It had good mechanical reliability, excellent crew ergonomics, and was produced in quantities that German industry could not hope to match. American factories built nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war. This numerical superiority was deliberate, strategic policy. American doctrine emphasized overwhelming the enemy through quantity, logistics, and sustainability rather than seeking technological parity in individual vehicle performance. But by the summer of 1944, the Sherman faced German tanks that had evolved far beyond the Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs it had been designed to fight. The Panther tank, introduced by Germany in 1943, represented a quantum leap in armoured vehicle design. Its frontal armour was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, providing effective protection equivalent to approximately 140mm of vertical plate. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun-firing standard M62 armour-piercing ammunition could not penetrate Panther frontal armour at any practical combat range. Even at point-blank range, less than 100 yards, the standard Sherman round would simply bounce off the sloped frontal plate of a Panther, leaving only a scar on the armour and an intact, very angry German tank. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42 litres, 70 gun, was one of the most powerful tank guns in the world. It could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. In a frontal engagement between a Sherman and a Panther, the German tank could kill the American tank from distances where the Sherman could not even damage the Panther. This was not a minor technical disadvantage. This was a fundamental imbalance that made frontal engagements with Panthers suicidal for Sherman crews. The Tiger I heavy tank was even more formidable. Its 88mm K-36 gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges approaching 3,000 yards. Its frontal armour, 100 mm thick and vertical, was effectively invulnerable to the Sherman's 75 mm gun except at extremely close range, and only when striking specific weak points. A Tiger engaging Shermans in open terrain was like a battleship engaging destroyers. The German tank could stand off at long range and methodically destroy American tanks that could not effectively return fire. American tankers in Normandy learned these brutal facts through experience that cost hundreds of lives and hundreds of tanks. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, serving with the 3rd Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion, documented the carnage in his post-war memoir, Death Traps. Cooper's job was to recover destroyed and damaged American tanks, repair those that could be salvaged, and catalogue those that could not. He saw firsthand what German tank guns did to Shermans: armour plate torn open like aluminum foil, turrets blown completely off their mounting rings by catastrophic ammunition explosions, interior compartments transformed into crematoriums, where crew members died by fire rather than by the prentice. Initial penetration. The Sherman had a particular vulnerability that tankers came to dread. Ammunition, stowage. Early Sherman models stored 75 mm rounds in sponson racks along the sides of the hull, just behind the armour plate. When a German armour-piercing round penetrated the Sherman's side armour, which it could do easily at normal combat ranges, the round often struck these ammunition racks. The resulting explosion would blow the turret off the tank and kill the entire crew instantly. Tankers called this catastrophic kill a brew-up, because the burning tank would brew like a pot of tea, smoke and flames pouring from the open turret ring. The British, with their dark humour, called Sherman's Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan was "Lights first time, every time." The United States Army attempted to address the firepower imbalance by developing improved Sherman variants. The M4 A176, introduced in July 1944, mounted the longer 76 mm M1 gun. This weapon had significantly better armour penetration than the 75 mm gun. With standard M62 ammunition, it could penetrate approximately 92 mm of armour at 1,000 yards. This was enough to defeat Panther side armour and could penetrate Panther frontal armour at close range if the round struck at an optimal angle. But even this improved gun could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal armour at normal combat ranges. And against the Tiger I's thick frontal plate, even the 76 mm gun was largely ineffective. Later in the war, American forces received limited quantities of M93 high-velocity armour-piercing rounds, which used a tungsten carbide core to achieve better penetration. These rounds could defeat Panther frontal armour at ranges up to 800 yards under ideal conditions, but tungsten was a strategic material in short supply. M93 ammunition was always scarce, and most Sherman crews fought the entire war using only standard ammunition that could not reliably penetrate the frontal armour of German medium and heavy tanks. The ammunition problem was partially addressed in March 1944 with a modification to ammunition stowage. The so-called wet stowage system moved most 75 mm rounds from the vulnerable sponson racks to protected compartments in the hull floor, surrounded by water-filled jackets that would help suppress fires if the ammunition was hit. Shermans with wet stowage were significantly less likely to suffer catastrophic ammunition explosions. Studies conducted after the war showed that wet stowage reduced the likelihood of fire after penetration by approximately 60%, but this modification did nothing to improve the Sherman's ability to destroy German tanks. It only made the Sherman slightly less likely to burn when it was hit. American tank doctrine, developed before the war and refined through combat experience in North Africa and Italy, emphasized aggressive action and exploitation of numerical superiority. American armour was trained to attack, to close with the enemy, to exploit breakthroughs and drive deep into German rear areas. This doctrine assumed that American tanks would be roughly equivalent to enemy tanks in combat capability. When that assumption proved false in Normandy, American tankers found themselves ordered to execute tactics that were suicidal when facing technically superior German armour. The standard American approach to encountering German tanks was to attempt to flank them. Use superior numbers to pin the German tank frontally while other Shermans maneuvered to achieve side or rear shots where armor was thinner. This tactic worked in theory and sometimes in practice, but it required terrain that permitted flanking maneuvers. It required numerical superiority of at least 3 or 4 to 1, and it required American crews to survive long enough to execute the maneuver, while German tanks fired on them from superior positions. In the close terrain of Normandy's bocage, flanking maneuvers were extremely difficult. Hedgerows channeled movement and restricted visibility. German tanks could position themselves in prepared positions with clear fields of fire, while remaining hull down behind terrain that concealed their vulnerable lower hulls. American tanks attempting to flank would expose their sides while maneuvering, presenting easy targets for German gunners who knew the terrain and had pre-registered their weapons on likely approach routes. The casualty statistics from Normandy were grim. The 2nd Armoured Division, which landed in Normandy on June 9, 1944, lost more than 150 Shermans destroyed in the first 6 weeks of combat. The 3rd Armoured Division suffered similar losses. These were not just vehicles. Each destroyed Sherman represented a crew of 5 men killed, wounded, or badly burned. The psychological toll on tank crews was severe. Men watched friends burn to death in tanks that had been penetrated by German fire. They knew that German Panthers and Tigers could kill them from ranges where they could not effectively fight back. They understood that in a fair fight, a one-on-one engagement in open terrain, a Sherman had almost no chance against a Panther. Tanker morale, which had been high during training in England, declined rapidly during the Normandy campaign. Replacement crews arriving from training schools in the United States or England were thrown into combat with minimal orientation. Some replacement tank commanders had never seen a German tank except in recognition photographs. They learned about Panther capabilities by facing them in combat, often dying in their first engagement. The veterans, men who had survived weeks of combat, developed a fatalistic attitude that bordered on resignation. You could do everything right, follow all the tactical procedures, maintain proper spacing, use terrain for cover, and still die instantly if a Panther spotted you before you spotted it. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson Hawkins, commanding a tank battalion in the 4th Armoured Division, wrote in his after-action report from August 1944 that the Sherman was at a severe disadvantage when engaging Panthers or Tigers frontally. He noted that his battalion had lost 18 Shermans in a single day of combat near Mortain, most of them destroyed by German tanks that the Americans never saw clearly enough to engage effectively. Hawkins concluded that frontal engagements with German heavy armour should be avoided whenever possible, but acknowledged that tactical situations often made such avoidance impossible. When American infantry was pinned down by German tanks, American armour had to engage, regardless of the odds. The United States Third Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George Patton, conducted a systematic study of tank losses during the breakout from Normandy in August 1944. The study analysed approximately 300 destroyed Shermans, examining the location of penetrating hits, the angle of attack, and the probable cause of destruction. The results confirmed what tankers already knew from experience. Approximately 70% of Sherman losses resulted from hits to the side or rear armour. Frontal hits accounted for only about 20% of losses. The remaining 10% were from hits to the top deck armour, usually from German Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck, infantry anti-tank weapons fired from elevated positions. This statistical pattern revealed an important tactical reality. When Shermans were destroyed in combat, they were usually hit from the side or rear, not frontally. This seemed counterintuitive. After all, American doctrine emphasized positioning frontal armor toward the threat. Tank commanders were trained to keep the strongest armor facing the enemy, but the statistics suggested that in actual combat, German gunners were achieving flank or rear shots even when American tanks were positioned with frontal armor toward the threat. The explanation lay in the nature of armored combat in close terrain and in German tactical doctrine. German tank crews and anti-tank gun crews were trained to be patient, to wait for optimal shots rather than firing at the first available target. A German Panther commander, spotting an American Sherman positioned hull down with frontal armor toward the German position, would often hold fire. He would watch the American tank, waiting for it to move, waiting for it to turn, waiting for it to expose thinner side armor. German crews understood that a side shot on a Sherman was almost guaranteed to penetrate and likely to cause catastrophic ammunition detonation. A frontal shot, while it might penetrate, was less certain and less likely to destroy the tank completely. German anti-tank doctrine also emphasized crossfire positions. German tanks and anti-tank guns would position themselves to cover the same area from multiple angles. When American armor advanced into a sector covered by German anti-tank weapons, the Americans would position their frontal armor toward the most obvious threat. But German gunners positioned on the flanks would then engage the American tanks from the side, where armor was thin and ammunition storage was vulnerable. American tank commanders attempting to rotate their turrets to engage these flank threats would expose their hull sides to other German guns. In the fluid combat following the breakout from Normandy, American armor advanced rapidly across France, sometimes covering 50 miles in a single day. German resistance during this period consisted primarily of small rearguard actions, delaying forces attempting to slow the American advance, while the main German armies retreated toward the German border. American tank losses during the pursuit phase were relatively light, because German forces rarely had time to establish the kind of prepared defensive positions that made German anti-tank tactics so effective. But as the Allied advance reached the German border in September 1944, the character of the fighting changed dramatically. German forces were now fighting on their own soil, defending their homeland rather than occupied territory. German morale, which had collapsed during the retreat from France, recovered somewhat. More importantly, German forces had time to prepare defensive positions in depth, to sight anti-tank guns carefully, to create the kind of killing zones where German technical superiority in tank and anti-tank gun design could be fully exploited. American armor found itself facing a tactical problem that seemed to have no good solution. The Germans held prepared positions with clear fields of fire. German tanks and anti-tank guns were positioned hull down or in concealed emplacements where they were difficult to spot until they fired. American tanks attacking these positions were forced to advance across open ground, exposing themselves to German fire while struggling to identify German positions well enough to return effective fire. And when American tanks did spot German armor, frontal engagements favored the Germans because Panther and Tiger frontal armor could not be reliably penetrated by Sherman guns at any practical combat range. Some American tank commanders began experimenting with unconventional tactics born of desperation and practical experience. These were not officially sanctioned techniques taught in training schools. They were battlefield improvisations developed by men trying to survive against technically superior opponents. One such improvisation involved a complete rethinking of which direction a tank should face during combat. The conventional wisdom, embedded in every armored warfare manual and drilled into every tank commander during training, held that a tank should always position its strongest armor toward the enemy. For the Sherman, this meant the frontal glacis plate, the sloped armor at the front of the hull that provided the best protection available on the vehicle. Tank commanders were taught to seek hull-down positions where the tank's hull was concealed behind terrain, with only the turret exposed, always ensuring that if the tank had to be exposed, it was the front that faced the threat. But in late summer and autumn of 1944, some American tank commanders began questioning this fundamental principle. The questioning emerged from careful observation of how tanks were actually being destroyed in combat, and from a cold-blooded analysis of the Sherman's vulnerabilities versus German anti-tank capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, was among the first senior officers to recognize a tactical pattern that contradicted conventional doctrine. Abrams was one of the most aggressive and effective American armor commanders in Europe, a man who understood tanks intimately and thought constantly about how to employ them more effectively. He had commanded tanks in combat since North Africa, had seen hundreds of destroyed Shermans, and had developed an intuitive understanding of armored warfare that went beyond what was taught in manuals. In September 1944, Abrams compiled casualty statistics for his own battalion and studied them with the same intensity he brought to planning attacks. What he found disturbed him. His battalion had lost 23 tanks destroyed in August and early September. Of those 23, 17 had been hit from the side or rear, only 4 had been hit frontally, and 2 had been hit from above by infantry anti-tank weapons. The pattern was overwhelming. Despite his tank commander's best efforts to position frontal armor toward threats, German gunners were consistently achieving flank and rear shots. Abrams began interviewing survivors from destroyed tanks, asking detailed questions about the circumstances of each loss. The accounts revealed a consistent pattern. Tank commanders would position their Shermans with frontal armor toward the most obvious threat, typically a suspected German position or an area where German tanks had been reported. The crew would feel relatively secure behind their frontal armor, knowing it provided the best protection available. Then fire would come from an unexpected direction, from the flank or rear, from a German gun position they had not detected. The first indication that they were under attack would be the penetration of side or rear armor, the catastrophic ammunition explosion, the fire. The survivors described a terrible helplessness. They had done everything right according to their training. They had positioned their tanks properly, maintained situational awareness, used terrain for cover. But German tactics exploited a fundamental weakness in American doctrine. By positioning frontal armor toward the primary threat, American tank commanders were making assumptions about where that threat was located. German gunners, patient and well concealed, would exploit those assumptions by firing from unexpected angles. Abrams realized that the doctrine of positioning frontal armor toward the enemy rested on an assumption that was often false in practice. The assumption was that tank commanders knew where the enemy was, but in the close terrain of European forests, in towns and villages, with buildings providing concealment, on battlefields obscured by smoke and dust, tank commanders often did not know where German guns were positioned until those guns fired, and by then it was too late. A tank positioned with frontal armor toward a suspected threat was vulnerable from every other direction. Its sides were exposed to any German gun positioned at an angle to the American advance. Its rear was completely vulnerable to German guns in positions the Yankees, Americans had bypassed or failed to detect. The Sherman's side armor was only 38 mm thick, vertical with no slope. The rear armor was also 38 mm. Any German tank gun or anti-tank gun could penetrate Sherman's side or rear armor at any combat range. Even the smaller 50 mm Pak 38 anti-tank gun, obsolete by 1944 standards, could easily destroy a Sherman with a side or rear shot. Abrams began to consider a radical idea. What if the Sherman's frontal armor, while stronger than its side or rear armor, was not actually providing meaningful protection in combat? The question seemed absurd at first. Obviously, thicker armor was better than thinner armor. Obviously, a Sherman's frontal glacis plate, effectively 100 mm when the slope was factored in, provided better protection than the 38 mm side armor. But Abrams was thinking in terms of practical combat effectiveness rather than theoretical armor values. Against German Panther and Tiger tanks, Sherman frontal armor was effectively meaningless. A Panther's 75 mm gun could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at any combat range. A Tiger's 88 mm gun could do the same. The Sherman's frontal armor would stop German 50 mm anti-tank guns at longer ranges, and might deflect poorly aimed shots from German 75 mm Pak 40 anti-tank guns if the round struck at an extreme angle. But against the weapons that posed the greatest threat to American tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and the excellent 75 mm Pak 40 gun that was the standard German towed anti-tank weapon by 1944, the Sherman's frontal armor provided protection that was marginal at best. Meanwhile, the statistical evidence showed that most Shermans were being destroyed by flank and rear shots, not frontal hits. This suggested that positioning frontal armor toward the threat was actually making American tanks more vulnerable by exposing their weaker side and rear armor to German guns positioned at angles to the American advance. Abrams discussed his thinking with his company commanders during a battalion meeting in early October 1944. He presented the casualty statistics, shared the survivor accounts, and laid out his analysis. Then he asked a question that must have seemed insane to officers trained in conventional armored doctrine. What if, instead of positioning our frontal armor toward the enemy, we positioned our rear armor toward the most dangerous known threat? The initial reaction from his officers was skepticism, bordering on disbelief. Position the weakest armor toward the enemy? That violated every principle they had been taught. It contradicted common sense. Thinner armor was more vulnerable than thicker armor. How could deliberately exposing the weakest armor possibly make tanks less vulnerable? Abrams explained his reasoning carefully. The Sherman's frontal armor was not actually protecting tanks from the weapons that were destroying most American armor. Panthers and Tigers could penetrate frontal armor easily. Therefore, the advantage of frontal armor over rear armor against these weapons was minimal. Both could be penetrated. Both would result in a destroyed tank if hit. The armor thickness difference did not matter when both armor types were inadequate, but there was one critical difference between frontal and rear armor that had nothing to do with thickness. The ammunition stowage. Even with wet stowage modifications, the Sherman carried significant ammunition in the turret basket and in the hull. A penetrating hit to the front of the tank had a high probability of striking ammunition and causing a catastrophic explosion. A penetrating hit to the rear of the tank would destroy the engine and transmission, which were located in the rear compartment, but was much less likely to detonate ammunition. A Sherman with its engine destroyed was immobilized, but not necessarily burning. The crew could survive and evacuate. The tank might even be recovered and repaired. A Sherman with its ammunition detonated by a penetrating hit was almost certainly going to burn, and the crew was almost certainly going to die. The difference between a mobility kill and a catastrophic kill was the difference between a damaged tank and 5 dead men. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Abrams proposed a tactical experiment. In situations where his tanks were forced to remain stationary in positions exposed to German anti-tank fire, particularly in defensive situations where American armor was supporting infantry or holding ground against German counterattacks, tank commanders should consider positioning their tanks in reverse. Face the rear of the tank toward the most dangerous known or suspected threat. Keep the turret traversed, so the main gun still pointed toward the enemy and could engage targets, but position the hull so that if a German round penetrated the tank, it would hit the engine compartment rather than the crew compartment or ammunition storage. The tactical advantages extended beyond just ammunition protection. A Sherman with its rear toward the threat could retreat rapidly if the tactical situation deteriorated. The driver simply shifted into forward gear and drove away at maximum speed. A Sherman with its front toward the threat had to turn around before retreating, a maneuver that took time and exposed the tank's sides during the turn. In combat, those few seconds could mean the difference between escape and destruction. There were obvious disadvantages to the reversed position. The driver's vision was more limited when driving in reverse. The tank was slower in reverse than in forward gears. The configuration felt wrong to crews trained for years to position frontal armor toward threats. But Abrams believed the advantages outweighed the disadvantages in specific tactical situations, particularly in static defensive positions where tanks were not maneuvering aggressively but were instead holding ground and providing fire support. Several of Abrams's company commanders agreed to try the reversed tactic experimentally. They briefed their tank commanders on the concept and authorized them to use reversed positioning when it seemed tactically appropriate. The results would not be fully apparent until the 4th Armored Division became heavily engaged in defensive combat, which happened in December 1944 when German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, when German forces attacked through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, smashing through thinly held American lines and driving deep into Allied territory. The offensive was Hitler's last major gamble in the West, an attempt to split Allied armies, capture the critical supply port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all its forces against the Soviet Union. The The German attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American intelligence had not detected the massive German buildup in the Ardennes. 3 German armies, approximately 30 divisions including 10 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, attacked a sector held by only 6 American divisions. The numerical superiority, combined with poor weather that grounded Allied aircraft and negated Allied air superiority, allowed German forces to achieve rapid initial success. By December 19th, German spearheads had advanced up to 50 miles into American territory, creating a large bulge in the Allied lines that gave the battle its name. American units were surrounded, cut off, and destroyed. Entire regiments surrendered or were scattered. Supply dumps were captured. Command and control broke down across wide sectors as telephone lines were cut and radio communications jammed. For several days, it appeared that German forces might achieve their strategic objectives and turn the tide of the war in the west. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in southern Belgium, became the focal point of the battle. Bastogne sat at the intersection of 7 major roads that German armoured spearheads needed to continue their advance toward the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp. If German forces could capture Bastogne quickly, they could use its road network to supply and reinforce their advancing spearheads. If American forces could hold Bastogne, the German advance would be channeled around the town through secondary roads and forest tracks, slowing the offensive and creating traffic jams that would make German logistics increasingly difficult. Major General Troy Middleton, commanding the 8th Corps, recognized Bastogne's importance immediately. On December 18th, he ordered elements of the 10th Armored Division to reach Bastogne and hold it until infantry reinforcements could arrive. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, commanded by Colonel William Roberts, raced to Bastogne from the south, arriving on the evening of December 18th, just hours before German forces began surrounding the town. Roberts had approximately 40 Sherman tanks, 20 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, 20 M8 armoured cars, and approximately 2,500 soldiers organized into 3 combined arms teams, designated Teams Cherry, Desaubry, and O'Hara. This was not a large force, but it was mobile, well-equipped, and composed of veteran soldiers who had fought continuously since Normandy. Roberts immediately established a perimeter defense around Bastogne, positioning his teams at critical road junctions and villages surrounding the town. On December 19th, the 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, arrived in Bastogne by truck convoy. The paratroopers had been resting and refitting near Reims, France, when the German offensive began. They had been rushed to Bastogne with minimal equipment, lacking adequate winter clothing, anti-tank weapons, medical supplies, and in some cases even ammunition. But they were elite infantry, experienced and well-trained, capable of holding defensive positions if properly supported. McAuliffe assumed overall command of Bastogne's defence, with Roberts's Armoured Combat Command providing the mobile firepower and armour support that airborne units lacked. By December 20th, German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne, cutting all roads into the town. The defenders were besieged, outnumbered approximately 4-1, facing German forces that included elements of at least 4 Panzer divisions and multiple infantry divisions. The Germans had Panthers, Tigers, and massive numbers of conventional artillery. They had air support when weather permitted. They had the advantage of maneuver, able to mass forces against any sector of the American perimeter while the defenders were fixed in place. The Americans in Bastogne had no air support due to weather conditions that kept Allied aircraft grounded. They had limited artillery ammunition, forced to ration shells carefully. They had no way to evacuate wounded, who accumulated in cellars and aid stations throughout the town. They had food for perhaps 4 days, if carefully rationed. They had fuel for their tanks and vehicles for perhaps a week of limited operations. And they were completely cut off, with no prospect of relief unless Patton's Third Army could fight its way through German lines from the south. For the American armour defending Bastogne, the tactical situation was unlike anything they had faced before. In Normandy and the pursuit across France, American tanks had operated primarily in offensive roles, attacking German positions, exploiting breakthroughs, racing through German rear areas. Even in defensive situations, American armor had usually been part of a larger defensive network with clear supply lines and the ability to withdraw if positions became untenable. At Bastogne, withdrawal was impossible. The town was surrounded. American armor had to hold fixed positions against German attacks that could come from any direction. Tank commanders could not choose their engagement ranges or select favorable terrain. They fought from whatever positions Roberts and McAuliffe assigned them, often in exposed locations where German observers could direct artillery fire with precision, and they faced German armor that was technically superior in almost every measurable way. Staff Sergeant James Gifford, whose tank we visited in the opening scene, commanded a Sherman in Team Cherry, positioned in the village of Longvilly east of Bastogne. Gifford was 24 years old, from a small town in Ohio, a veteran of 6 months of continuous combat since Normandy. He had seen Shermans destroyed by German tanks in France. He had learned through bitter experience that frontal engagements with Panthers were suicidal. He knew his Sherman's vulnerabilities intimately. On the morning of December 22nd, Gifford's tank was positioned in Longvilly to cover the road from the east. German reconnaissance elements had probed the position during the night, withdrawing before American forces could engage them effectively. Gifford knew a major German attack was coming. He could hear German vehicles moving in the darkness beyond the village. The distinctive sound of German tank engines, higher pitched and more metallic than American engines. He could see the flashes of German artillery impacting on Bastogne itself, several miles to the west. Gifford discussed the tactical situation with his crew. They were positioned with their Shermans front facing east, toward the expected German attack, exactly as doctrine prescribed. The tank was partially concealed behind a stone barn, hull down with only the turret clearly visible. It was a good defensive position by conventional standards, but Gifford had been thinking about something Lieutenant Colonel Abrams had mentioned during a battalion meeting weeks earlier, something about reversed positioning and protecting ammunition from penetrating hits. The more Gifford thought about it, the more sense it made. His Sherman's frontal armor would not stop a Panther round. If a German Panther spotted his position and fired, the German round would penetrate regardless of whether the Sherman's front or rear was facing the threat. But if the rear was facing the threat and the round penetrated the engine compartment, Gifford and his crew might survive. They could evacuate the tank. They could fight as infantry if necessary. If the front was facing the threat and the round penetrated the crew compartment or detonated ammunition, they would all die. Gifford made a decision that violated every instinct trained into him during months of armoured warfare instruction. He ordered his driver to reposition the tank, turn it around, face the rear toward the east, toward the Germans. Keep the turret traversed, so the 75mm gun still pointed east and could engage any German tank that appeared. But position the hull in reverse. His driver, a corporal from Pennsylvania named Michael Kelso, initially thought Gifford was joking. Reverse positioning? Face our weakest armor toward the enemy? That was insane. But Gifford explained his reasoning calmly. The frontal armor was not protecting them from Panthers anyway. If they were hit, positioning the engine between them and the German round might save their lives. Kelso, after a moment's thought, agreed. He started the engine and carefully repositioned the Sherman. The reversed Sherman looked wrong to observers. Other tank commanders from Team Cherry, seeing Gifford's tank facing the wrong direction, called on the radio to ask if he was preparing to withdraw. Gifford explained that he was not withdrawing, merely repositioning for better survivability. His explanation was met with skepticism, but other tank commanders were too busy preparing their own positions to argue. At approximately 08:30 on December 22nd, German forces launched their assault on Longvilly. The attack began with artillery bombardment, 88mm guns, and 105mm howitzers dropping shells on the village. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes, destroying buildings, cratering roads, and filling the air with smoke and dust that reduced visibility to less than 100 yards. When the artillery fire lifted, German armour advanced. Panthers and Panzer IVs emerging from the tree line east of the village, supported by Panzer grenadiers in half-tracks. The German tanks moved cautiously, aware that American armor was present, but unable to identify specific positions through the smoke and debris. German tank commanders scanned the village through their optics, searching for the distinctive silhouette of Sherman tanks. Gifford watched through his periscope as 3 Panthers advanced along the road toward his position. The German tanks were moving in column formation, approximately 50 yards apart, their commanders standing in open turret hatches to improve visibility. Gifford traversed his turret smoothly, keeping his 75mm gun trained on the lead Panther. He waited. Range decreased. 400 yards, 300, 250. The lead Panther stopped, its commander apparently spotting something suspicious about the barn where Gifford's Sherman was positioned. The German turret began traversing toward Gifford's position. Gifford knew he had perhaps 5 seconds before the German gunner acquired him and fired. He ordered his gunner to fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun cracked, the recoil rocking. The tank. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther on its turret side, a glancing hit that gouged the armor but did not penetrate. The German tank was not destroyed, but the hit clearly indicated its position. The Panther's turret completed its traverse, the long barrel of the 75mm gun pointing directly at Gifford's Sherman. The German gunner fired. Gifford saw the muzzle flash, heard his loader scream a warning, then felt the tremendous impact as the German round struck his tank. The sound was overwhelming, a metallic crash that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The tank shuddered. Something tore with a screaming metallic noise. The engine died instantly, but Gifford was still alive. His crew was still alive. The German round had penetrated the rear armor exactly as Gifford had known it would, but instead of tearing through the crew compartment or detonating ammunition, it had destroyed the engine. The Continental radial engine, 400 horsepower of cast iron and steel, had absorbed the German round's energy. The engine compartment was a wreck, but the crew compartment was intact. Gifford ordered immediate evacuation. His crew scrambled out of the disabled tank, taking the .30 caliber coaxial machine gun and as much ammunition as they could carry. They took cover behind the stone barn as German artillery began falling again, German observers having spotted the knocked-out Sherman. Within 2 minutes of being hit, Gifford and his entire crew were clear of the tank and taking cover in a fighting position prepared by infantry. 15 minutes later, another Sherman from Team Cherry, positioned with conventional frontal armor toward the threat, was struck by Panther fire from a different direction. The German round penetrated the Sherman's side armor and detonated the ammunition stored in the hull. The tank exploded, the turret lifting off the hull in the characteristic brew-up that Sherman crews dreaded. None of the crew escaped. 5 men died instantly in the catastrophic explosion. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. Gifford's crew, in a tank positioned with rear armor toward the threat, had survived a direct hit from a Panther. Another crew, following conventional doctrine with frontal armor toward the threat, had been killed instantly when hit from an unexpected angle. Both tanks were destroyed. Both were total losses. But one crew survived and the other did not. Word of Gifford's survival spread rapidly through Combat Command B. Tank commanders on the radio net heard the reports of both tank losses and understood immediately that reversed positioning had saved lives. Within hours, other tank commanders in Team Cherry began repositioning their tanks in reverse when holding static defensive positions. The tactic was not appropriate for all situations. Tanks conducting offensive operations or rapid maneuvers needed the better visibility and higher speed that came from forward positioning. But in static defensive positions where tanks were dug in and holding ground against German attacks, reversed positioning offered a survival advantage that was becoming impossible to ignore. Colonel William Roberts, commanding Combat Command B, heard about the reversed positioning tactic on December 23rd. His initial reaction was skeptical. Tanks facing backward seemed absurd, a violation of basic principles. But when he examined the casualty reports and survivor accounts, the evidence was compelling. Roberts authorized his tank commanders to use reversed positioning at their discretion in static defensive situations. He did not make it mandatory, recognizing that different tactical situations might call for different approaches, but he made it clear that reversed positioning was a legitimate tactic supported by command. Over the next week, as German forces launched repeated attacks against the Bastogne perimeter, American tank crews experimented extensively with reversed positioning. The tactic evolved through trial and error, with lessons learned in one engagement being shared across the radio net and applied in subsequent fights. Tank commanders developed techniques for employing reversed positioning most effectively. The optimal use of reversed positioning required careful consideration of terrain and likely threat directions. Tank commanders would analyze their defensive positions and identify the most dangerous threat axis, typically the direction from which German armor was most likely to attack. They would position their tanks with rear armor facing that threat axis, while ensuring that the turret could still traverse to engage targets across the entire defensive sector. Communication between tank commanders and infantry was critical. Infantry positioned around the tanks would warn of German movements and help identify threat directions. Tank commanders, with limited visibility when buttoned up inside their tanks, relied on infantry observers to provide early warning of German attacks. The coordination between armor and infantry became increasingly sophisticated as the siege continued, with both branches learning to support each other more effectively. Reversed positioning worked best when tanks were properly dug in. Tank crews would excavate fighting positions that allowed the tank to back in until only the turret was exposed above ground level. The hull, whether facing forward or backward, would be below ground level and protected by earth. This hull-down positioning multiplied the effectiveness of reversed tactics, because even if German rounds penetrated the thin rear armor, they would strike the engine compartment rather than continuing through into the crew compartment. The psychological adjustment to reversed positioning was significant for many crews. Decades of training and doctrine had emphasized positioning strongest armor toward the threat. Deliberately exposing weakest armor felt wrong, felt suicidal, even when the tactical logic was explained carefully. Some tank commanders tried reversed positioning once, found it too psychologically uncomfortable, and returned to conventional positioning. Others embraced it immediately, recognizing that survival mattered more than adherence to conventional doctrine. By December 26, when elements of the 4th Armored Division finally broke through German encirclement and established a supply corridor into Bastogne, approximately 60% of Combat Command B's remaining tanks were employing reversed positioning in their defensive sectors. The 10th Armored Division's after-action reports from the Bastogne siege documented this tactical evolution and attempted to quantify its impact on tank losses and crew casualties. The statistical analysis was complicated by the chaotic nature of the battle and the difficulty of determining exact circumstances for each tank loss. But the ordnance officers who compiled the data made their best effort to separate tanks lost while using conventional positioning from tanks lost while using reversed positioning. Their findings were remarkable and would influence American armor doctrine for years to come. Of 42 Sherman tanks lost by Combat Command B during the siege of Bastogne, 14 had been employing reversed positioning when hit. 28 had been using conventional forward positioning. This raw number appeared to suggest that conventional positioning resulted in twice as many losses as reversed positioning. But the analysis needed to account for the fact that not all tanks were using reversed positioning, and the percentage using reversed positioning increased over time as word of its effectiveness spread. The ordnance officers estimated that approximately 40% of tank hours during the siege were spent in reversed positioning, with 60% in conventional positioning. When losses were normalized for exposure time, the difference became even more striking. Tanks using conventional positioning experienced approximately 18 losses per 1,000 tank hours of exposure. Tanks using reversed positioning experienced approximately 6 losses per 1,000 tank hours of exposure, but the most significant difference was not in total losses but in crew casualties. Of the 28 tanks lost while in conventional positioning, 24 suffered catastrophic kills with total crew losses. 120 men died in those 24 tanks. The remaining 4 tanks were mobility kills, where some or all crew members survived. Of the 14 tanks lost while in reversed positioning, only 2 suffered catastrophic kills with total crew losses. 12 were mobility kills where crews evacuated successfully. The survival rate for crews in reversed position tanks was approximately 86%. The survival rate for crews in conventional position tanks was approximately 29%. This dramatic difference, a 65% reduction in casualties when using reversed positioning in static defensive situations, could not be ignored or dismissed as statistical noise. The explanation for this difference lay in the Sherman's internal layout and the nature of tank combat at Bastogne. When a Sherman was penetrated from the front or sides, German rounds typically struck either crew members directly or ammunition storage, causing immediate catastrophic effects. When a Sherman was penetrated from the rear, German rounds struck the engine and transmission first. These components, while mechanically destroyed by armor-piercing rounds, absorbed much of the round's kinetic energy and often stopped the round completely or deflected fragments away from the crew compartment. The engine compartment of a Sherman was separated from the crew compartment by a steel bulkhead and firewall designed to contain engine fires. This barrier, while not designed as armor and not thick enough to stop an armor-piercing round directly, did provide some protection when combined with the mass of the engine itself. A German round that penetrated rear armor, destroyed the engine, and then struck the bulkhead with significantly reduced energy might stop at the bulkhead or penetrate with insufficient energy to cause catastrophic damage to crew or ammunition. Even when rear-penetrating rounds did reach the crew compartment, they typically struck the turret basket from behind, an angle that often resulted in rounds passing through the turret without detonating ammunition. The ammunition stored in the turret was positioned in racks on the sides and floor. A round entering from behind would need to strike these racks directly to detonate ammunition, whereas a round entering from the side or front would pass through the crew compartment at an angle that made striking ammunition racks much more likely. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army and responsible for the relief of Bastogne, reviewed the Combat Command B after-action reports in January 1945. Patton was known as an aggressive, offensive-minded commander who emphasized attack and exploitation. He had little patience for defensive tactics or what he considered timid, cautious approaches to warfare. But even Patton could not ignore casualty statistics that showed a 65% reduction in crew losses. On January 8, 1945, Patton issued a memorandum to all Third Army armoured units recommending the use of reversed positioning in static defensive situations. The memorandum was carefully worded to emphasize that reversed positioning was a supplement to conventional tactics, not a replacement. In offensive operations, aggressive maneuver, tanks were to maintain conventional positioning with frontal armor toward the threat, but in static defensive positions where tanks were supporting infantry or holding ground, commanders were authorized and encouraged to position tanks in reverse with rear armor toward the primary threat axis. The memorandum included specific guidance on when reversed positioning was appropriate and when it was not. It emphasized the importance of proper digging in, of maintaining fields of fire, of coordinating with infantry, and of being prepared to revert to conventional positioning if the tactical situation changed. Most importantly, it made clear that reversed positioning was about crew survival, not about avoiding combat or seeking safety at the expense of mission accomplishment. Other American armies in Europe received copies of Patton's memorandum and the supporting analysis from Bastogne. The First Army, the Seventh Army, and the Ninth Army all issued similar guidance to their armoured units. By February 1945, reversed positioning in static defence had become standard practice across American armoured forces in Europe, though its implementation varied significantly between units depending on leadership attitudes and tactical situations. The Germans noticed the American tactical change and were initially confused by it. German tank commanders and anti-tank gun crews, spotting American tanks positioned with rear armor toward German positions, initially assumed the Americans were preparing to withdraw. Some German commanders held fire, waiting for the Americans to begin their retreat so German guns could catch them in the open during movement. When American tanks remained in position and engaged German forces effectively while facing backward, German intelligence officers began documenting the tactic and attempting to understand its logic. A German intelligence report from February 1945, captured by American forces and later translated, described the reversed positioning tactic and speculated about its purpose. The German analysis concluded that American tank crews were attempting to reduce catastrophic losses by protecting ammunition storage with engine mass. The report noted that the tactic appeared most common in static defensive positions and recommended that German anti-tank gunners aim for flank shots rather than rear shots when engaging reversed American tanks, as flank armor remained vulnerable and did not benefit from engine protection. The tactical evolution continued through the final months of the war. American tank crews developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for employing reversed positioning, learning when it was most effective and when conventional positioning was preferable. The tactic became part of the informal body of knowledge that experienced tankers accumulated through combat and passed on to replacement crews. After the German surrender in May 1945, the United States Army conducted extensive studies of tank losses and crew casualties across all theaters. The Armored Force Board, responsible for doctrine development and equipment evaluation, compiled data from thousands of tank engagements in Europe and the Pacific. The analysis of static defensive engagements confirmed what Combat Command B had discovered at Bastogne. Reversed positioning in static defense reduced crew casualties by approximately 60 to 65% compared to conventional positioning while having minimal impact on tank loss rates. This finding forced a fundamental reconsideration of armored warfare doctrine. For decades, doctrine had emphasized positioning strongest armor toward the threat. This principle remained valid for offensive operations, where tanks were maneuvering aggressively and needed protection during rapid advances. But in static defensive situations where tanks were holding fixed positions against attacks from known threat directions, crew survivability could be improved dramatically by positioning the engine as a shield between the crew and incoming fire. The doctrine that emerged from this analysis was more nuanced than previous armor doctrine. It recognized that different tactical situations required different approaches to survivability. Tanks operating offensively needed speed, maneuverability, and the ability to engage targets while moving. Frontal armor positioning remained optimal for these situations. Tanks operating defensively from static positions needed maximum crew protection against inevitable hits from German anti-tank weapons. Reversed positioning provided that protection at acceptable tactical cost. The Sherman tank that had served as the primary American medium tank throughout the war was replaced in American service after 1945 by new designs that incorporated lessons learned during the war. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which saw limited combat in the final months of the European war, had thicker armor and a more powerful 90mm gun. The M46 Patton, introduced in 1949, represented a complete redesign incorporating wartime experience. But even these improved tanks retained the basic vulnerability that had made reversed positioning necessary for the Sherman. Ammunition storage remained a critical vulnerability. Engine compartments remained in the rear. The principle that positioning the engine between the crew and incoming fire could improve survivability remained valid. Reversed positioning in static defense became a standard tactic in American armor doctrine, taught at Fort Knox and other training facilities, incorporated into field manuals, and practiced in training exercises. The veterans who had fought at Bastogne and discovered reversed positioning through desperate improvisation watched this doctrinal evolution with mixed feelings. They were proud that their tactical innovation had been recognized and incorporated into official doctrine. They were satisfied that future tank crews would benefit from lessons learned at such terrible cost. But they also understood that no doctrinal innovation, no tactical technique, could eliminate the fundamental dangers of armored combat. Tanks would always be vulnerable to enemy fire. Crews would always face the possibility of sudden, violent death. Staff Sergeant James Gifford, whose reversed Sherman had been knocked out on December 22nd, but whose crew had survived, returned to the United States in June 1945. He was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to an armored training unit at Fort Knox, where he helped train new tank crews in tactics learned during European combat. He made certain that every crew he trained understood reversed positioning and knew when to use it. In 1949, Gifford attended a ceremony at Fort Knox honoring veterans of the Bastogne siege. He met other tankers who had employed reversed positioning during the battle, men who had survived tank knockouts that would likely have killed them if their tanks had been positioned conventionally. They shared stories, compared experiences, and marveled at how a tactic that had seemed insane when first proposed had become standard doctrine. Gifford spoke briefly at the ceremony about his experience on December 22nd. He described his decision to reverse his tank, the skepticism from other crews, the Panther round that penetrated his rear armour and destroyed his engine but left his crew alive. He emphasized that reversed positioning was not about cowardice or avoiding combat. It was about surviving combat so you could continue fighting. A dead crew could not accomplish any mission. A surviving crew could evacuate their disabled tank, take up infantry weapons, and continue contributing to the battle. The lesson from Bastogne, Gifford said, was that sometimes the best tactics were the ones that violated conventional wisdom. Sometimes you had to think about the problem differently, consider unconventional solutions, and have the courage to try something that seemed wrong according to everything you had been taught. The doctrine that said position frontal armor toward the threat was correct for most situations, but not all situations. In the specific circumstance of static defense against technically superior German armor, where penetration was almost certain regardless of which armor faced the threat, crew survival became the priority, and reversed positioning provided better crew survival. The statistical legacy of Bastogne was clear and undeniable. Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division had entered the battle with 42 Sherman tanks. By the time the siege was lifted on December 26th, all 42 had been knocked out or destroyed, but approximately 130 tank crew members had survived to fight again, evacuating disabled tanks and continuing the battle as infantry, or being assigned to replacement tanks brought in after relief. Without reversed positioning, casualty estimates suggested that perhaps 50 to 60 crew members would have survived. The difference was 70 to 80 lives saved by a tactic that had been improvised under desperate circumstances and refined through trial and error during the most critical battle of the war in the West. The broader impact of reversed positioning extended beyond casualty reduction. The tactic demonstrated that American forces were capable of tactical innovation and adaptation even in the midst of desperate combat. It showed that good ideas could emerge from field experience and be rapidly disseminated through informal communication networks before being formalized into doctrine. It proved that conventional wisdom, while usually correct, was not infallible and should always be tested against actual combat experience. The Germans, who had entered the war with technically superior tanks and sophisticated armor doctrine, never developed an equivalent to reversed positioning. German doctrine remained focused on frontal armor positioning and aggressive maneuver. German tanks, particularly Panthers and Tigers, had thicker armor that provided meaningful protection against Allied anti-tank weapons, making frontal positioning more valuable for German crews than it was for American crews facing German guns. But even German tanks were vulnerable to flank and rear shots, and German casualty rates in tank crews remained high throughout the war. The Eastern Front saw similar patterns of tank losses and crew casualties, though Soviet tactical doctrine approached the problem differently. Soviet tank crews, operating 34 medium tanks that were generally superior to German tanks in the early war, but increasingly outmatched by later German designs, developed tactics emphasizing mass and maneuver rather than individual tank survivability. Soviet doctrine accepted high casualty rates as the price of offensive success, replacing lost tanks and crews through massive industrial production and training programs. American doctrine after 1945 reflected a different philosophy. American industrial capacity could produce tanks in enormous quantities, but American political culture would not accept casualty rates that Soviet doctrine considered normal. Tactics that reduced crew casualties while accomplishing missions were highly valued. Reversed positioning fit perfectly into this doctrinal framework. It was a technique that improved crew survival without requiring new equipment or extensive training, developed by soldiers in the field and validated by statistical analysis. The final chapter of the reversed positioning story came decades after the war, when military historians and veterans organizations began documenting the tactical innovations of World War II. The History Division of the United States Army Center of Military History published a monograph in 1973 examining tactical adaptations during the Battle of the Bulge. The monograph devoted an entire chapter to reversed positioning, describing its development, implementation, and impact on casualties. The monograph concluded that reversed positioning represented one of the most significant tactical innovations developed by American forces during World War II. Unlike technological innovations such as proximity-fused artillery shells or radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, reversed positioning required no new equipment or scientific research. It was purely a tactical adaptation, a new way of using existing equipment that emerged from careful observation of combat patterns and willingness to challenge conventional doctrine. The veterans who had survived Bastogne and other battles reversed positioning saved lives received no special recognition for developing the tactic. There were no medals for tactical innovation, no formal awards for the tank commanders who first experimented with reversed positioning, or the company and battalion commanders who authorized and encouraged its use. Their reward was simpler and more profound. They had survived. They had helped other crews survive. They had contributed to victory and lived to return home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.